So as you've already heard, the Westwood Media Center is recording, and they'll be making it available, the recording available, either in the next few days or shortly. It'll be on their website, and I think they'll probably be broadcasting it on the access channels as well. So thank you everybody for coming tonight and for being with us to talk about these important topics. We're hopeful that the information and discussion shared here tonight will help us move closer to a safer, more sustainable world. The meeting is being hosted by OPEN, the Organization for the Preservation of the Environment and Nature. OPEN is a citizen action group founded in the 1990s to help preserve the natural resources and environment of Westwood. It was the precursor organization to the Westwood Land Trust and has been involved with a variety of conservation and preservation initiatives over the years. Most recently, OPEN was reconstituted in part to help identify appropriate locations for solar power installations that will help preserve the character and sustainability of our natural assets. To that end, we asked Tom Philbin if he would help us bring the community up to date on our town's efforts in this area. Now you're going to get a really brief description of who Tom is because his resume is really long and really impressive. Tom Philbin has been our town energy manager since 2014. Prior to that, he spent 40 years working in environmental sciences, nuclear power, and energy conservation. He received an award from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 2018 for his climate change initiatives in Westwood. He's been working diligently for Westwood for the past 6 years to help us become more energy efficient and independent. His experience is too much to name, but I personally believe we are fortunate to have his insight and knowledge in looking at the important energy saving initiatives around town. Thank you, Tom, for taking the time to do this presentation for us all tonight.
Okay. All right, thank you, Kevin. With that, I would just say I'm glad to have the opportunity to summarize what the town of Westwood as a green community is trying to do to meet some of the renewable energy and conservation goals of the Commonwealth. And with that, I would say that Westwood became a green community several years ago, and I'm going to try tonight to tell you what a green community means. I'm going to try and describe what the conservation projects that we've done in Westwood and what the phase 1 and phase 2 solar initiatives were planned to be, and what the town goals longer term are, and what are some of the alternatives that we have in terms of potentially locating solar throughout the town. Excuse me. If you are a green community in the state of Massachusetts, which is most of the state right now, you have 5 criterion that you have to meet. You have to have zoning that facilitates renewable siting. In other words, it has to be a fairly smooth process, and and criterion 2 that can be expedited so that there's no long dragging out of years before that things can be done. You have to have a baseline established. In 2012 was our baseline. We have a list of all of the consumption that was in that baseline year, and we have to technically shoot to get to be 20% less than that baseline over a 5-year period. That's simpler said than done for 100 different reasons, mainly because this town itself is a moving target in terms of constant changes, additions of wings, like for example at Thurston, adding of air conditioning units to schools, changing some out, things that are working that weren't working before, and so forth. So it's not as straightforward as you might think. And just the recording of the data is a challenge because every electric bill has 2 or 3 factors on it that have to go into the actual figuring of the consumption, and somebody has to go apply those factors and then make sure that they're uniformly applied over all 70, if you can believe it, there are 70 accounts that cover the town's consumption of electricity. Lastly, we have to adopt a fuel efficient vehicle policy. We now have 2 all electric vehicles. We have 1 plug-in hybrid, and we're looking to buy approximately 2 more. And we're also looking to add some charging stations throughout the town. We have 1 2-vehicle charging station now over at DPW. And last, the criterion 5, the town has to adopt a stretch code, which is essentially all the designs of the buildings in terms of insulation and so forth have to be approximately 20% above whatever the base code is. So Westwood did all of these. We adopted the criterion, and we were designated as a green community. And as such, we were given an award of, at that time, $138,000 to start a series of projects. Once you're a green community, you have a lot of different requirements. One is you have to every year report to the Department of Environmental Conservation, DOER, what's your progress toward the 20% goal. And also by being a community, we're able to compete for grants for different energy conservation projects. As a town, we've won 6 consecutive competitive grants from DOER from 2015 through 2020. The value of the grants that we've received from DOER is about 1.4 million. And we've got an additional 500,000 in grants from Eversource. And those 1.9, roughly 2 million, went toward a whole series of projects which had a value of about 2.8 million. If we look at the energy savings from all of those projects, just straight energy now, I'm not talking about anything with solar, we save approximately $250,000 a year off our energy bill. That's how much of a reduction in consumption we've had. And that if we look at the payback, when we take all of the incentives into account and we take all of the costs that the town had to put into it, the town gets its money back in 4 years. And these savings, again, will persist for 20 years into the future, forever, really. But just for ways of, or means of calculation, we usually do it in a 20-year lifetime. The programs have been very successful, and I'll give you an idea what some of the ones we've done. We've converted all of the schools essentially to LED lighting. That's at Thurston, Downey, Martha Jones, the Rec Center, Deerfield, Media Center, Council on Aging, Library, and so forth. All of the street lights in Westwood have been converted to LED, and we have now what we call a radio frequency mesh system. Each street light communicates with every other street light, and the mesh is set up over the town. This allows us to surveil all the lights continually, see which ones are on, which ones have failed, whether they're operating properly or not. And eventually, the mesh will allow us to add systems to the town. For example, we may be able to read water meters through the street lights. We may eventually, we definitely could, if we wanted to spend the money now, get what they call shot detection systems, where if somebody fires a gun in the town of Westwood, there's an immediate signal sent to the police department, and they dispatch within minutes to the latitude and longitude of where the shot was fired. So it's a very sophisticated system. At the pool, we have a new hot water heating system. We put in a pool cover. So the pool is covered every night. That saves a tremendous amount of water and heat. If you go to that pool and you put your hand in at night, and then when we pull the cover over in the middle of winter, if you come back the next day, you'll be very hard pressed to feel the difference. That's how well it works. At Deerfield, we replaced the boilers. We put all new controls in. We put all new controls on the air at Downey and Martha Jones. By air quality capability, what I mean there is there are sensors in the air supply ducts, so that if there's an increase in carbon dioxide or something else like that in the system, which means there's not proper ventilation, the ventilation itself will speed up or slow down, and keep the levels at CO2 and other things at a minimum level that is consistent with the health and safety of the students. At the Council on Aging, we replaced a whole series of their windows. We're looking to replace more now. They had that big glass window on one side, which let a tremendous amount of heat in and a tremendous amount of heat loss in the winter. We put a large insulating shades there, which seemed to bring that under control. We've had constant upgrades of steam traps at Thurston and at Town Hall. As part of that effort now, we're trying to get rid of all the steam boilers in the town, but we did have by increasing the efficiency of the steam traps, or the quality of the steam traps, we did increase the efficiency of the system itself. We've got new temperature controls at most of the schools. We have a new lighting control system that was installed at the high school. We have another very sophisticated lighting control system installed at the library. We've converted all of the town parking lots to LED, all their lighting rather to LED. We've purchased 2 electric vehicles and 1 plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We went down 109 and we converted all of the decorative lights on 109 to LED. And on the pool pumps, we put a variable frequency drives, and that again increases the efficiency of the drives themselves. Essentially, they run at a speed that's needed to keep the pool at the proper temperatures as opposed to on off. So these drives will speed up and slow down. And again, there's a savings in energy as a result of that. Currently in progress, we're replacing all of the unit ventilators at Thurston. Some of these unit ventilators, if you can believe it, were 50 years old. There were ducts frozen shut from rust and so forth. All of them are being replaced. They'll be 100% new ventilators. Each classroom will have a temperature control within a range of about 10 degrees. And then there'll be a centralized control so that all of the ventilators can be turned down at night or whatever. There'll also be if you're familiar with the term, but a MERV 13, which is the high efficiency filtration on the air. And we're looking at the possibility of adding an ionization cleanup device that will kill any viruses or so that might be in the air. We're looking at doing the same thing or a similar thing at the Council on Aging. We're replacing all of their heating, ventilation, their air conditioning. We've added a split system there at the entrance, and that takes care of the offices where we're always underheated, undercooled. And again, at the town, we're going to eliminate the steam system that takes care of now takes care of all the floors. But what we're doing at the town hall is we're going to cut the steam off from the upper floor and then put in a split system there and convert all of that to electricity and high efficiency. And again, improve the comfort eventually of the people who work there. We're not going to do the downstairs yet. We will eventually, but we take it a step at a time, depending on the money that's available for these kinds of efforts. The solar is the second major effort that we have as a town. There's a goal we have that's consistent with the goals that most of the energy managers in the state have had, that we're trying to reach a point where 90% of the electricity that we consume as a town is covered by renewables. So we started, and this makes good sense, especially since there's a big effort in the state, so that by 2035, all of the electric that's generated in this state will be from renewable resources. This varies from town to time. Some people are fighting against it now, and there are probably 3 or 4 different proposals in the legislature where people are thinking about making it a percent of what it was in 1990, all the way up to having everything forcibly converted by the year 2050. And there's all kinds of variations in between, and there's no real regulation that's come out of it. But it makes good sense for Westwood to plan ahead and to do everything we can so that we're as renewable as we can be by the time all these years roll around. The first phase of the solar involved essentially 4 buildings. We looked at the whole town. We looked at all kinds of options. We went over everything we could do. We ran into problems depending on where we were, and we chose these 4 schools as the place to start. We had 1.7 million invested in the rooftops at the high school, Martha Jones, Downey, and Thurston. At Downey, we even got to the point where we had to get a new transformer because the amount of electricity when you had the solar added was so much the transformer was inadequate. So we had to get a new transformer. And then when we got a new transformer, when they inspected it, they found out that the cables, since the school was so old, were laid directly in the ground and had to be in concrete conduits. So then we had to dig it all up and put in concrete conduits to the new transformer. And then when we had the new conduits in, we found out that we couldn't go across the street because it had just been paved. So we had to put a pole in and run wires across to tie into the Eversource network. So these are the kinds of things that come when you're trying to do something you think will be simple by just putting panels on a roof, but you run into all kinds of other not minor necessarily, but minor things. But what we were able to do at the Downey was we were able to take approximately a penny and a half of the incentives and use that to finance the new transformer and the new electrical infrastructure that had to be installed. And Martha Jones was another example. When we got to the roof of Martha Jones, we found there was an area of the roof that tended to pool water. Not enough that you had a problem in the school, but enough that you couldn't put the solar there. So we ended up putting less solar than we thought. We thought Martha Jones would have as much as Downey, but when we got there with the art of the practical, and we had to cut the size down to 151 versus 180, 190. Downey, for example, most days will generate more power than it consumes. So the excess goes to offset the rest of the town's consumption. The way it works is on all of these cases, every solar kilowatt that we generate, the town gets paid 26 cents, anywhere between 22 and 26 cents. And then we have to pay the contractor approximately, well, it varies by the school, but roughly 12 cents. So the net between the 26 and the 12, or the 24 and the 12, depending on the time of the year, is the amount of money that we get that offsets the electric bills in the town. At this period of time, 2-3 years ago, these were very, very generous incentives. They're not as generous anymore. And as time goes on, there are less and less incentives being available. We actually generated about 616,000 kilowatt hours of solar power in the 2019-20 fiscal year. And now we're getting into phase 2 of the so-called incentive program that's offered by the state called the SMART program. The phase 2, what we had identified as possibilities was a production of approximately 3 million kilowatts. It involved those 4 items you see: Thurston, the Council on Aging, the Shuttleworth, and the police station. The Shuttleworth has been scrapped since, so we lose that 2,460,000 kilowatt hours, but that's no longer under consideration. But you can see how the amount of money that's generated from these kinds of projects comes out. We were going to get about $60,000 in savings. We were going to get about incentives, and we would probably get another 10,000 from the leasing of the land, where a lease rate is paid by the contractor to the town. So this is roughly what was planned for, estimated for 2, and now it has to be altered. We're still going ahead with some parts of it, but not all of it. If you look at the town's consumption, it's roughly about 5.5 million kilowatt hours a year. If you look at the amount of solar that we've generated a relatively small amount of the 90%, which is the long-term target. Only about 10% is currently generated by solar, but we have signed on to participate in what they call a virtual solar, which is a large solar project in Waltham, where we guarantee that we have the high school in this case will take the total output of that solar project, and they then pay us 10% of the total cost or the total value of what's generated. So it's an easy way to involve yourself in solar. These projects are few and far between, but when you get the chance, it's a found 2,000 kilowatt hours that's generated, and we get about $70,000, $80,000 a year just in benefits. What happens is Eversource will send us a certain amount of money, and we have to pay 90% of that money to the contractor in Waltham. So it's a found 10% essentially, and we use that money then, of course, to offset electric bills. So this says that we need another 3 million kilowatt hours, essentially, if we're going to be roughly 100% covered by our solar. Just by way of some terms and definitions, if we look at what the SMART program is, it's the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Targets. And it's a program that's a long-term sustainable energy project supported by Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. The idea is to encourage solar voltaic technology in the town, in the state rather, and have approximately 1,600 megawatts of solar generating capacity over the 5 years that the program will be running. Just so you get our term straight, renewable energy credits. These are the credits that are produced from the solar array generation. They have a market value. So every kilowatt hour that's generated has a value, and that's the so-called RECs that are done. The SMART program is divided into capacity blocks, and each block, of which there are 8 blocks, they have a declining incentive level. So if you're in block 1, you get the maximum incentives. If you're in block 8, you get the least incentive. So there's a certain amount of set-asides and a lot of other criteria, whether you're a municipal or a whatever, or a private business and so forth. All of these things affect where you are, but there's a very complicated formula which determines where you are in those blocks and how much of an incentive you'll get for every generation, for the generation of every solar kilowatt hour. I get my terms mixed up. And there are adders available so that if you're doing a solar field or an array that's on the ground, you get one set of an adder. If it's a rooftop, you get another adder. Or if it's a canopy, you get another adder. If it's community solar, you get another adder. So all of these things affect the degree and the amount of the incentive. So it's very complex. The main thing about this that we have to watch is the longer you wait, the less the incentive. So if we do something 5 years from now, there'll probably be no incentive. If we did it last year, there'll be a little more incentive. This year is another incentive, and next year will be something less. We also enter into what we call a power purchase agreement. This is an arrangement in which the developer, in our case, it's Ameresco, where they put up all the money, they do all the work, and they then sell us the electricity at a discounted rate with a 20-year contract. We have the option after 5 years to buy it out. But the reason you want to do this is because the town, since we're not a nonprofit, we can make no use of the investment tax credits. These tax credits are now about 28% of the value of the project. So if you put $1 million in, 28% of the million comes back as a tax credit. That's useless to a town like Westwood. But to a company like Ameresco, they can use it going back or forward to offset profits. So when we sign a power purchase agreement, they take the investment tax credit, and after 5 years, they've used them all. And at that point, it may or may not be worth our while to buy the project out. At the end of 20 years, we will own the project. And then we have it from 20 years to whatever length of time beyond that it lasts. It most likely will last forever if we keep the solar panels up to date. This saves the money, because this inability to use the investment tax credit makes it financially very difficult for a municipality to own a solar facility outright. It does not make economic sense usually to own it outright. Okay. An example of what a typical field array, and this again, these numbers came from the proposed now abandoned SolarWorth project. If you're generating about 2.5 million kilowatt hours annually, you would save the town approximately 2.25 cents a kilowatt hour. That generates about $60,000 in savings for a 20-year period. And then in addition to that, the so-called pilot payment is the rental of the space, and that's another $10,000 a year. So you get about $70,000 a year in incentives to the town as a result of having that kind of an array built. There's a second set of incentives which are not defined yet, but you add a solar to the solar array, you add a battery system, and the battery system, we get added incentives for that, and the battery is used to allow the utility, Eversource, to regulate some of the peak periods in their system, in their grid. So they pay us to allow us to use the excess energy from the solar or the energy that's stored in the battery system for controlling their peaks, and for that they pay us a certain amount of incentive. So all of this together would amount to something in the order of, in excess of, in that case, of about $70,000 per year. A field array is the most preferred, mainly because it's got the highest incentive per kilowatt hour. You don't get as much for a canopy, and you don't get as much for a rooftop. They're trying to encourage field arrays because they're simpler. A 10-acre output is got 10 times the potential of the output of rooftops, and a 10-acre of a field array is actually as much as all of the rooftops in the town of Westwood. In the town, the municipal buildings, at least, I'm sorry, I meant not all the roofs, but all of the municipal buildings in the town of Westwood. The 10-acre output is 2 times greater than, for example, if we put up canopies on the high school parking lot, which is a large open area. And it is a major contribution, obviously, to the town's goal of reaching a 90% renewable. After 5 or 20 years, the benefits, if we were to buy the system out or put up by way of a loan or by whatever, some other method, we bought the system at the 6th year or at 20 years. 20 years, we would own it outright anyway, and we would allow Amoresco or somebody else to keep the maintenance going, and we'd pay them as a lesser fee for that. Or at 5 years, we can have a loan and actually it'd be depreciated approximately 50%. And once it gets to the 50% point, the amount of money that we'd have to put up would be far less. The system that on the 10-acre site was approximately $5.5 million in value. Again, there's educational potential at all of these solar arrays. If you notice at the high school, there's a kiosk, and the students that go and come from the high school can look at the kiosk and see what solar is being generated on what buildings and how much of CO2, for example, is being offset. So it makes them aware of the environment and makes them aware of how critical it is for us as a town and as a nation to start to look at how do we reduce our carbon footprint. And again, it allows us to approach the 100% renewable ultimate goal. Again, to restate it, we'd like to reach 90%. And we have several towns in the Commonwealth that are considering banning fossil fuels for all new construction. So I think it makes sense for Westwood, to the extent that we can, to plan ahead in our future to get away from any kind of fossil fuels to the extent that we can, because eventually all of the electric generation in the state is expected to be renewable, and that would make us 100% with eliminating the carbon footprint of all of the buildings that we have in operation. We need 3 million kilowatts of solar generation to reach the 100% or 90%. That amount varies with time as we move forward. And a good example of that is Town Hall. When we get rid of the steam, we're installing high efficiency split systems that are electric, so that by going electric, we're increasing the electric consumption, but we're cutting out some of the gas consumption. The same thing at the new school that's being planned for Hanlon. They're going to have a geothermal heat pump system there. So that's going to be all electric. And again, by being all electric, it cuts out the use of gas. So if you look at the gas consumption at Deerfield and at Hanlon, that's going to be essentially eliminated by the fact that the new school will be 100% electric, and there will be no more gas purchases for that facility. Again, as I mentioned before, time in the SMART program decreases the incentives as we get placed in lower and lower generation blocks. So it behooves us to move as quickly as we can feasibly. And again, the investment tax credit itself is going down. And depending on what happens on November the 3rd, the probability of a new investment tax credit or a tax credit dying is kind of up in the air. I would never chance to predict what's going to happen then. And again, we should take advantage of all the current incentives and try to ensure that we have the positive economics that we can. It's all right to build a system if we get just minimally positive results, even though it may not be super lucrative. The fact that we're displacing CO2 and and some of the benefits of doing that make it still, in my opinion, worthwhile, since we are doing more and more toward achieving our renewable goals. Some of the ground arrays that we're looking at, we look at, is there private property that could be leased? In other words, we're looking at the possibility of any company around here and then Westwood that would allow us to use their property, and we would pay them a rent, and we would build a solar array on that field. Or we have a number of parcels that are around that we maybe could do. Again, we would have the same debate whether there be tree cutting or not tree cutting. In Thurston, we're planning to put an addition on the Thurston roof. There's 85 kilowatts. Thurston, originally, we planned to put that 85 kilowatts, but they were working on the roof there. There was some damage to the roof of the gym area, and they were doing the work, and we couldn't do it in the phase 1. So that's a phase 2 project. The canopies that we've looked at is the high school parking lot. That's a big parking lot, big potential. The Council on Aging parking lot, which is much smaller. The police station, the police would love to get a garage, essentially a solar garage that would eliminate the need for snow plowing in the wintertime, and it would also keep the cars out of the snow and eliminate a lot of the problems they have sometimes with people slipping and so forth in that station. So they would love to have a parking garage, and that is in the plans right now. The garage would be something similar. If any of you have been out to the REI facility in Framingham, they have a solar garage in the front of their building there. That gives you an example of what can be done. Another good example of canopies that I think is very nice is if you drive up the hill to the headquarters for the Eversource, they have made the entrance almost like an entrance with the canopies that sort of feels like you're driving into someplace. It's really very, very attractive, I think. Some of the other things that we're looking at, the rooftop on the New Hanlon School, you could put something on that when the time comes. However, since that school is down the road a bit, 2-3 years out, we don't know what the economics would be at that time. The rooftop of the police station has a small amount that's possible. The Islington Fire Station in Westwood itself, rather the Islington one, the new one, has about a 50 kilowatt potential. And the main fire station has approximately another 50 kilowatt potential. The DPW buildings over in Carby Street have a potential of about 25 kilowatts. There's a large piece of land that's owned by the town, has conservation restrictions, so we'd have to look at that. And it's also heavily wooded. That has about a 500 kilowatt potential. The parking lot behind Thurston has a canopy potential. The canopies could go at the main fire station in Westwood. You could put some there, especially in the back of the building. The library has some potential. The rooftop at Deerfield, as well as the front of the Deerfield and the back of Deerfield, have canopy potential. And the DPW parking lots have some potential for canopies. All of this, again, canopies are not as lucrative, although they're economic at this point. You're not going to get the same 1/4 cents a kilowatt hour, 2 1/4 cents a kilowatt hour that you would have gotten with a field array. And depending on how fast we can move, we may not be. We may be in a different tranche on the SMART program, and that may affect the size of the incentives that we'd be eligible for. So what I've been trying to do is, without having any money come out of the pocket of the town, is get all of these solar programs off the ground with the power purchase agreements. So far, for all of the solar that we have, the 700 plus kilowatts and the virtual solar, the town has had to put up zero money, and we're getting close to $100,000 a year in benefits. So the potential for these benefits was much greater a few years ago. It's not as great going forward, but then going forward, we still have the need to get as near as we can to 100% renewable in terms of the coverage of the town's consumption, and as near as we can to helping the state reach its goals of 100% renewable energy in all of the buildings. So with that, which is rather quick, I'll start taking any questions you may have. And I'll ask Kevin, please, to maybe field them if you could.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. We've had people sending us some questions along the way. One of the things that you practically every municipal building in town, I guess, was somewhere in this presentation, except for the Sheehan School. There was no mention of the Sheehan School, and I'm not suggesting that it's better or worse than any other building, but I just noticed that it was one of the only municipal buildings not mentioned. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, there's a reason why it hasn't been done anything with conservation or with solar, is because there's major renovations coming. And there's no point in, for example, changing out lighting and everything else inside when you're going to be taking it all back out again. So until it's when we finish the new Hanlon school, then they're going to turn their focus of attention to Sheehan and what they have to do with Sheehan, and Sheehan will require major renovations. So that's why it's not mentioned anywhere.
I see. Okay. So then let me start reading some of the questions that people have sent into the chat. The first one says, can you tell us how close Westwood is to achieving our green communities Criterion 3 goal of a 20% energy use reduction from our 2012 baseline?
What I can tell you is this: we're very close, and we have not exceeded reducing the amount of consumption in the town by 20% of what it was in the year 2012. Now, having said that, to show it by meter readings and show it by actual data is extremely difficult for the following reasons. There have been 58 air conditioning units added to schools as we try to air condition some of the elementary schools and the high school and so forth. These are all high electric consuming devices. There has been, as we fix some of the things that we've had at the high school, we end up with higher consumption, more efficient, but higher consumption as we convert a lot of the gas consumption over to electric. So, and then we have, for example, the library itself. If you look at the old library, which was in the 2012 baseline, and the new library, you have another problem with in terms looking at the BTU comparisons. The new library not only has about 2 or 3 times the square footage, but the volume is significantly greater. And the adjustments that they allow us to make don't take into account volume. And volume affects the heat and the amount of BTUs that are consumed. So the problem we're having is, demonstrating it mathematically. And it turns out this is the same problem a lot of the different towns are having. We even had the addition of the wing on Thurston. And all of these things, again, are affecting the amount of consumption. When we fix things, we sometimes increase the consumption when we fix the infrastructure. So when we take a bulb out and the bulb is 100 watts and we replace it with a 10 watt LED, we know we've got a 90 watt reduction. If I multiply that out times the number of hours that the lights operated, I have the kilowatt hours that are saved just by absolute calculation. But it's not as simple as that, because even though we're taking out hundreds and hundreds of lights and replacing them with more efficient lights, at the same time, we're adding air conditioning, we're having changing use patterns, we're doing things differently. And every time we change even the usage patterns, it affects the consumption of electricity.
Okay. All right, another question. You mentioned that we have a couple of municipal vehicles already that are electric, and someone submitted the question, will the charging stations be for town vehicles or for Westwood residents?
We have proposals to make them available to residents. We also, if, for example, we were to get electric police cars, which is a possibility, we would have to have one that would be dedicated to the police vehicles themselves. People can use the one that's at DPW if the lot is vacant, but generally we have 2 over there and 2 vehicles. So there's no prohibition at the moment, but it's a problem that prevents us from putting them more widely. If you were to put them, for example, in the high school parking lot, we'd be afraid that a student would pull in, plug in, and that'd be it for the day. And there's no way to control that. So the controlling the use of them is a problem. What the suggestion was, and there was a company that has a proposal before us, that you would pay and you'd get an hour and then you have to pay again and so forth, or would turn off. But still, if somebody plugged in and paid for their hour and then didn't come back for 3 hours, we're still blocked from reusing that station. So we really haven't figured out a good way to make charging stations available to the public without and avoiding the complications of somebody abusing the process.
Okay. Here is a question that, let's see, from Steve, and it says, how and when was the 90% goal set? That is
That
news
goal
to us.
is not a formal town goal. That's a goal that was set by essentially the energy managers, and we have a meeting, an annual meeting, and we all discuss, and the goal we had was the 90% by 2025, which we set as a group. So that 90% goal is essentially came out of those meetings several years ago. It's not a fixed thing by the state or by the town itself.
Okay. Peter asks, what is holding up the high school parking lot canopy?
Those were proposed several times. There's a lot of objection to the aesthetics of canopies.
All right. So we don't have technical problems with that, but it may be something the town has to revisit if we're going to think about it in a serious way.
That's right. It's
okay.
There's nothing technically preventing us from doing it everywhere I mentioned, but there is a lot of strong feelings. There's as many strong feelings about canopies and their aesthetics as there are about trees and taking trees down.
All right. Here's another question from it's a different Peter. How efficient is thermal energy compared to solar energy, and does it fit into the town's plan to increase use of renewable energy? Does thermal energy fit into our plan?
You mean hot water, solar hot water heating? I'm not sure what is meant by that.
How efficient is thermal energy compared to solar energy? So maybe geothermal?
Geothermal? Well, geothermal is it's a heating air conditioning system, but it's not, to my knowledge, it's not an electric. So to get comparing a bit of comparing of apples and oranges there, I think.
And is it a, I guess the other part of this question is where does that fit into our town plan for the use of renewable energy?
Well, the geothermal system that's been put in it's going to be put in at the new Hanlon School is extremely efficient, and that reduces our need for electricity. So that was the reason that makes that building, the goal of that building in terms of the energy use, the EUIs as they call it, if that building, if we design it and the way it's designed, and if it comes out the same way, which is most likely it will, but there's always a few things along the way that might complicate it. But the design goal of 21 of an EUI will make it the most efficient school in the Commonwealth.
Okay. All right. Here's the questions are continuing to come in, so I have more now than I had when we started. So another question. This one's from Dugan. He says, on the topic of battery storage, since we are now looking at distributed solar rather than one large site, how does that impact our storage options? Are we considering smaller batteries at multiple sites?
You can, but the again, size here is an asset. If they're too small, the economics are not there. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head where the break point is, but at the 2 megawatt size that we had at Hanlon, it was definitely economic to put the battery system in. I'm sure at a 25 kilowatt size, like we're looking at some of the smaller buildings, I doubt it would be economic.
Yeah. And you had mentioned, I think, that those bring, when you use those storage systems, it brings an added incentive and kind of an economic benefit to those. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
It also allows Eversource to control their peaks better.
All right. Here's another question. Do field installations create more energy than roof or canopy? I'm a little lost on the finances.
It's not a matter of it per panel. They're approximately the same, but in terms of the incentives you get, they're different. And in terms of the cost of the installation themselves, there are differences just depending on the construction cost. But the panel itself is a panel's a panel. They can be pretty much the same thing.
Okay. Could we please hear about the options at the high school again? This may have been somebody who came in maybe a little later. I'm not sure, but can you just kind of review that again, the high school?
Well, the high school is facing the wrong direction, so there's very little roof space that's usable. And we used all we could on the flat part over the pool and the recreation center and that part there. There's also a problem over there with some of the large equipment casting shadows, because a shadow on a panel affects a whole array of panels, not just one. So there was a lot of area there that was not on the roof of the high school that was unsuitable. The parking lot is wide open. Again, there's a lot of concerns about the economics, about the aesthetics, rather, excuse me.
Okay. Here's a question. Is there any available use at University Ave, even if we have to lease land?
There may be. I mean, for example, Target has a large solar array on the roof already. There are other rooftops there that could be used, but the problem you have is some of these companies are not willing to make a 20-year commitment. So you can't guarantee the building is going to be there for 20 years. And you can't even guarantee, for example, that the shopping center itself is going to still be there, that it might not, for some reason, given all the changes that we're seeing in our shopping patterns and everything else, that the whole shopping center may go the way of become one big Amazon or something, and put up apartment houses or something else there. So you can't get the time frame that you might need by way of guarantee. So you have to have some ability to get a long-term commitment, and that's where the problem comes in. The town of Westwood's not going to go anywhere. I couldn't say the same for Target. I couldn't say the same for some of the businesses that are over there.
Right. All right. Here's someone is asking, what are your thoughts about a program to promote residential solar? And the second part of their question is the new school being designed so that the roof will be ideal for solar panels? So two different questions from one person.
We have in the past run forums. WEAC has run a forum, the Westwood Environmental Action Committee, where they invited different solar contractors in to explain what they could do for rooftops. So they could be asked to do that again, but yes, it has happened. The town itself would help WEAC do that, but the town itself has not sponsored anything itself for encouraging solar on rooftops. In terms of the roof of the new school, yes, it is going to be solar ready, and it is. All of the heavy equipment that's going on the roof is going to be oriented in such a way as to minimize shadowing and minimize any interference with solar panels that might be put up there later.
Okay. Here's a question from Dave. Could we incentivize New England development to put solar canopy over the parking lots at University Station and guarantee to use that electricity in the same way we are doing with the Waltham project?
Believe it or not, you're just over the border into a new load zone when you get to the station at the MTA. And there has been proposals to do a virtual solar on that already. And it got nowhere because they couldn't get enough takers. But it would do us no good at all because it's considered Canton, and it's in the southeast load zone, and we're in the north zone. So it's not in the same load zone. In order to take advantage of these virtual projects, you have to be in the same load zone as the project itself. So it's hard to believe that Waltham would be in the same zone as Westwood and Canton wouldn't be, but that's the way it is.
Tom, can you just give a quick description of what a load zone is? I mean,
Yeah, it's I hesitate because I'm not 100% familiar with the term, but as I understand it, a load zone is a contiguous area where all of the distribution and interconnections and substations, et cetera, are all balanced in such a way that it operates sort of like its own zone, well, within the larger utility area that's serviced by Eversource. So they've divided their service territory up, and they have certain things they do in one zone they don't do in another, and so forth. For example, if I wanted to get a new transformer, I would go to the north load zone supply house that's in Walpole, whereas somebody in Canton would have to go to a different supply area to get the zone. So they handle everything differently. And they require that if you're going to do anything virtual, you have to be in the same load zone. In fact, one of the problems we had was there was a debate as to whether Downey, which is so close to Canton, was in the south or the north zone. And they allowed us to essentially call it north zone when we finished the project, Eversource did, because that would have we could not then have taken the totality of all the solar and counted it as Westwood. We could only count everything but the Downey project, and that would have to be a separate one. And it would be subject to different incentives. Everything else varies. For example, in the south zone, very often in a virtual solar, they may get a whole different economic payment than they would in a north zone. It all depends on the amount of people that are coming and doing it and how easy it is to do it. It's very hard to do it when you get close to Boston. As you get away from Boston, it's much simpler to do a lot of these solar projects.
Okay. Here's a question similar to maybe the University Ave one. It's we may have already addressed this. Is it possible to consider rooftops of private property like the skating rink at University Ave? But I think you addressed that we will be here, but we don't know if the skating rink will be here in 20 years, and so it makes leasing kind of difficult.
It does. Any place where you can't get a long-term commitment.
Yeah.
Again, a piece of land doesn't go anywhere, and essentially, if you get the right agreements, you know you're going to have it.
Right.
Any kind of a private development, it's much more difficult.
All right. Here's a question: have we explored solar ground arrays with towns that share boundaries with Westwood? I assume this would be outside of. Well, I don't. You. There's the question. I won't assume anything.
Yeah, there is a believe it or not, a parcel of land that on the North Street that is half Westwood and half Walpole. And when they proposed putting a ground array there, the protests were all over the place. So I never even bothered trying to take the Westwood piece and do anything with it because it was heavily treed, heavily wooded, and there was an enormous upwelling of the neighborhood when they even proposed or looked at it in Walpole. So that's the only place I know where we have a boundary which we could do it. Could we do something with another town that might have space? I suppose so. We could just lease the space from the other town, Norwood or somewhere else. I have not surveyed the other towns. Another example would be, for example, Moderna. They're Norwood, and they have enormous parking lots that back right up onto Westwood and the Gay Street, Gay Street. It is Clavetree and Gay Street. And this, if you do as I run all over the town with Google Earth, and if you go over that area, you'll see these enormous parking lots, open areas. But when I checked it out, again, Moderna is a private facility, and it's in Norwood. So we would have to work out some sort of a deal with both Norwood and with Moderna to use that kind of property for canopies in that case. I'm sure there are other areas like that especially along 195. There are spots that are, one to me that's very logical is if you drive down 109 and you go over the bridge into Dedham, you got that quarter of a mile of land in between the, you know, up the north-south lanes of the 128, and that goes all the way from the prison down to Dedham. There's an enormous amount of space in there, heavily wooded. There are, if you go over it again with the Google Earth, there are spots that are sparse. So there's a possibility there, but there you'd have to go to the state and get some sort of an agreement with the state of Massachusetts before you could touch that land. All of the, Amoresco has a contract. If you go up on the Mass Pike and you get to exit 17, you'll notice all of the entryway and exits from the highway are covered with solar panels. That's a deal made with the MBTA, or not Mass, the Highway Authority, whatever. And they cut a deal, Amoresco did, and they've been doing that all over the state. I don't know who you would approach to do something similar on 128.
Someone just texted that they think that that is the Dedham Town Forest. So maybe that's something to do with how or why that's not really an option. But we have a lot of questions, so let me just move on. Here's someone says, could we hear a little more about options for the 5-acre parcel you noted in the presentation?
Not right now. It would be, it's premature to talk about it. Just that it's there and it's a possibility, but it's not a possibility I would want to talk about right now, because it would complicate anything I might do further.
Okay. Here's a comment. It seems absurd that there are concerns about aesthetics of the high school parking lot. A question related, how can we get people to think positive about the canopy at the high school? I think that's kind of more of a rhetorical question, unless you want to address it. How do we get people to think more positively about the aesthetics?
Well, you know, I always use bridges as an example. People think bridges are beautiful. I think they're beautiful. The engineering eye always thinks they're beautiful. But there are just a lot of people also who think they're horrible and you should never build them. And it's the same thing with a canopy. It's in the eye of the beholder. And it's some people think they're horrible. They don't like them. They look industrial. And you hear all kinds of comments about it. Other people say, it's a garage, it's a parking lot. How can you hurt the aesthetics? You get all kinds of arguments either way. If you go to Stonehill College, they have their entire student parking area now as one big solar garage. And the kids love it because they can walk to class and never go outside in the rain or the snow. And they have a whole huge field array as well. Their goal was 100% of the college covered by solar generation.
Well, it's timely because our next comment here was that a real benefit of solar for students is not just educational, but it also gives them some hope for their future. It actually helps preserve their future. And someone else says it also provides sun and snow cover year-round. Let's see.
Minimizes plowing.
Yeah.
Safety issues.
So you save some money on that, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Have renewables other than photovoltaics been considered, like wind, for example?
Well, not in Westwood. There's no, if you look at there's a map that's put out by the federal government. I'm not sure which agency of the government that tells you where wind is feasible and not feasible in terms of the frequency and the persistence of wind. And there's nothing in Westwood that would qualify.
Okay. Can ground mount sites be used for other purposes in addition to the array?
Oh, absolutely. They can be, you can raise them slightly and you can grow vegetables and other things underneath. So that's one of the most common uses. One of the concerns was, with this nesting or anything else going on. Again, if the panels are off the ground, it doesn't interfere with any nesting. It's, you just avoid the seasons where the breeding takes place and install them accordingly, and then things return to normal very quickly. There's been suggestions of using goats and animals to graze the area. In fact, one of the proposals at the Norfolk Aggie takes that into account, the fact that they may be able to grow vegetables and graze animals underneath the proposed panels out there that are going to be put in.
Interesting. Okay, this one says, here's somebody suggesting kind of the Meditech campuses as a possible site for a canopy. Not a question, but an observation, comment.
I'm sure it's open and could be used. We would have to again have an agreement, a long-term agreement, and they would have to come along with us on that.
Yeah, well, we're all looking for solutions. Here's one. Please remind the residents that the town last year approved the community aggregation program. The program has been delayed due to delay in the DPU approval. Hopefully it will be in place next year. As part of this program, residents will be able to opt to purchase electricity with up to 100% renewable content. Do you want to add anything to that, Tom?
Yeah, well, actually the DPU hearing is tomorrow at 2:00. And at that point, they're going to hear the arguments for, and if there are any against it. And the DPU is going to hopefully make a ruling rather quickly, and the town is going to go forward with it. And exactly, you'll have multiple options. You can take what they call the base option, which should be equal to or slightly better than what you're paying now, or there'll be multiple other options, at least two, where you can pay more on your bill, and then essentially you're going to have your supply will come from sources equal to approximately 25, 35, 50%. In Brookline, they can go to 100% and pay a couple cents more. So it's going to be an option. It's more costly, but if somebody feels strongly about these things, they can pay the excess and then through the community aggregation program, get as much renewable as they want to pay for.
Okay. Here's another thought, comment, referring back to your bridges comment. The town may have more of an appetite for canopies if we start naming them after people.
Oh, the University of Arizona has a huge canopy field, and what they did was literally that's what they sold advertisement on flags that people put on it, and so they have a field of flags on. It's quite pretty on top of the canopies, and each of them represent some industry that contributed, actually paid for the thing and pays a small fee for the advertisement. Another incentive.
It's been happening on athletic fields forever.
Yeah.
Now here's a question about growing vegetables in the shade under solar panels. Does that really work? How does that work?
I'm not a farmer and I don't know, but there is tons of literature out there. If you want to get the name, I'll send it out to you.
Okay. This looks like a final comment here. Simply says, "We are so lucky to have Tom working for Westwood!" Exclamation point. I think that's the perfect way to end, honestly.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll name the first canopy the Tom Philbin canopy. So thank you, Tom, for spending a little time with us and really helping people get a basic understanding of, some of what we're trying to do here and what you've been really working on for the last 6 years. You've done a great job. And I think, you're seeing with all the people turning out to this meeting that there's really an interest in furthering that work. And so I look forward to working with you. And I think probably many people on this call look forward to what you're going to do next and how we further your efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming.